look around you right now. Just take a second to really observe the environment you're sitting in or maybe walking through while you listen to this deep dive.
Yeah, just take it all in.
Right. Think about the device in your hand. Consider the lights overhead, uh, the climate control, keeping the air comfortable, or even just like the coffee you picked up on the way.
All those little things.
Exactly. Every single one of those elements, the data streaming into your ears, the electricity powering the bulb, the roasted beans, they are all delivered to you by a system of almost incomprehensible, just borderline miraculous efficiency.
Miraculous is a good word for it, honestly.
It really is. We have supply chains that span the globe, power grids balancing these massive loads in milliseconds, fiber optic networks moving terabytes of data across oceans before you can even blink.
Right.
We live in a world that has been relentlessly engineered for decades for absolute maximum efficiency. But what happens when the very systems that make our modern world so incredibly capable become the exact reason it could all just completely unravel?
Well, that is the ultimate double-edged sword of our era, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, we have built a world where everything touches everything else. And while that brings us undeniable benefits, it also introduces a type of vulnerability that human civilization has literally never had to contend with before. Not on this scale, anyway.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today. We're looking at a highly intense, really fascinating source document that outlines a scenario called Objective 000.
Objective 000.
It's a heavy one.
It is. It's basically a framework used by national security strategists to examine the extreme fragility of our globally interconnected world. We're going to look at what happens when the invisible webs we rely on every single day are pushed past their breaking point.
Right, and I think...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, before we get into the grim details, we really need to make sure we're framing this correctly. Because when you read a title like Objective 00, it sounds like, a Hollywood doomsday script.
It totally does. It sounds like a Roland Emmerich movie or something. Exactly. Which is why we need to set a very clear analytical tone right from the start. When we talk about Objective 00, we are not looking at a prophecy.
Right.
This document is not a prediction of inevitable doom, nor is it some predetermined apocalyptic timeline. In the specific language of the strategic community, it's considered a terminal scenario or a boundary condition.
A boundary condition. Kind of like finding the absolute edge of the map where the dragons live.
Precisely that. It's a structured model. Strategists use models like Objective 00 to understand what happens if global conflict escalates way beyond the ability of our international institutions to contain it. Think of it like this. Structural engineers, right? They don't build a complex computer model of a suspension bridge collapsing because they want the bridge to fail.
Right, or because they think it's going to fall down tomorrow.
Exactly. They build the model to understand the precise stressors, the wind shear, the load capacity, the resonance that would cause a failure.
So they know the limits.
Yeah, because once you understand the mechanics of the collapse, you can engineer the bridge to withstand those specific forces. So Objective 00 is basically an engineering stress test for modern human civilization.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how the bridge collapses, we first have to understand the fundamental architecture of how it was built, right?
Right.
And that brings us to the core thesis of the paper, which really highlights the grand paradox of modern civilization.
It does. And the central premise of the Objective 1000 document is actually quite elegant in its simplicity, I think.
How so?
Well, it argues that our modern civilization is defined by two interlocking realities. First, unprecedented technological capability, and second, deep economic interdependence.
Okay, tech and trade.
Right. And the thesis states that these highly interconnected systems, precisely because they are so optimized and efficient, have a hidden, just profound vulnerability to cascading failures. The efficiency itself is the threat vector.
I was trying to visualize this when I was reading the source, and the best analogy I could come up with is comparing the modern global system to an incredibly advanced, multi-million-dollar modern sports car.
Oh, I like that.
You know the type, right? Where everything is controlled by a central computer, the aerodynamics are tested in a wind tunnel, the engine is tuned to microtolerances.
And the transmission shifts in a fraction of a second.
Exactly. On a perfectly smooth track, it performs absolute miracles. It is a pinnacle of human engineering. But if there's one tiny glitch in the onboard computer, say, like a single mass airflow sensor fails, or a line of current in the transmission control module gets corrupted, the entire vehicle can essentially brick itself.
It just shuts down.
Right, it shuts down to protect the engine. It becomes a very heavy, very expensive paperweight.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize what sociologists and systems engineers call tightly coupled systems.
Right, and if you contrast that with, say, a clunky old pickup truck from the 1950s,
Oh yeah, totally different beast.
that truck is nowhere near as fast. It's terribly inefficient, it burns gas like crazy, and the ride is super rough. But if the radio shorts out, or a headlight gets smashed, or even if you lose a gear, the engine keeps running.
It doesn't care.
It really doesn't. The parts aren't talking to each other through a central brain. It's loosely coupled, way less efficient, but fundamentally far more resilient to localized damage.
That's a great comparison.
So my pushback here, or the question that naturally arises when reading this for you, is the document arguing that we made a mistake by building the sports car? Like, is progress itself the danger? Are we supposed to go back to the clunky truck?
It's a crucial distinction to make, and the source text is very careful not to fall into Lettism here.
Okay.
Progress itself is absolutely not the danger. The technological capability is what allows us to feed 8 billion people, cure diseases, and pull billions out of extreme poverty.
Right, we don't want to lose that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The danger, as the text emphasizes, is the interdependence that comes with that progress, specifically when you couple it with the potential for human conflict.
Ah, human conflict.
Right. The document states that these systems become vulnerable to cascading failures only when conflict escalates beyond containment.
So it's not the technology in a vacuum. It's the intersection of our incredibly advanced, tightly coupled systems with our very old, very human tendency to get into geopolitical fistfights.
Yes. The risk outlined in Objective 1000 isn't just a random mechanical failure. It's not just a sensor randomly burning out in your sports car.
Right.
It's the intentional introduction of friction into a system that has literally zero tolerance for it. It's what happens when you are driving that ultra-fast sports car at 200 miles an hour, and suddenly the road turns into a combat zone and the driver starts making erratic, panicked steering inputs.
Oh, man, yeah.
Because everything is tightly coupled, a shock to one part of the system is instantaneously transmitted to all other parts of the system.
To make this incredibly real for anyone listening, think about something as mundane as buying a cup of coffee.
Let's hear it.
You don't hand over a physical coin anymore, right? You
Right.
tap a piece of plastic or your phone. In the 2 seconds it takes for that transaction to be approved, your device communicates with a cell tower, which routes through a fiber optic cable to a massive data center, which interfaces with a financial institution's servers.
All happening in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, and those servers validate your identity, check your balance, and transfer the funds. Simultaneously, that transaction might ping the inventory management software of the coffee shop, which is tied into a global logistics network that is actively tracking shipping containers of coffee beans crossing the ocean from Colombia or Ethiopia.
It's a massive chain.
It is. And all of that relies on GPS satellites, undersea cables, and an uninterrupted supply of electricity.
And every single node in that vast network has been optimized to strip out excess capacity. I mean, we don't build giant warehouses to store months of coffee beans or microchips anymore.
Right, we use just-in-time logistics.
Exactly. The beans arrive exactly when they are needed. The servers spit up capacity exactly when demand spikes.
Because holding extra inventory or building backup servers, well, that costs money. It's inefficient.
It is. But just-in-time logistics means there is no slack in the system. There are no shock absorbers at all.
Wow.
Objective 00 asks a terrifying question, honestly. What happens if that invisible, hyper-optimized web is weaponized? Or what happens if it simply breaks down under the weight of global conflict?
If interconnectivity is the fragile foundation of our modern world, what is the spark that threatens to break it?
Well, the document doesn't just leave this as an abstract philosophical worry. It outlines the specific mechanisms that generate these sparks.
So let's pivot to those mechanisms of escalation. The paper outlines 5 specific engines that drive us toward this systemic collapse.
Yes, 5 main drivers.
If you are a national security strategist sitting in a war room, these are the 5 dashboards you have to monitor simultaneously. And they start with the ancient, classic drivers of human conflict, right? Geopolitical tension and economic and resource stress.
These are the foundational elements. They are the tectonic plates grinding against each other.
Right.
Geopolitical tension is defined in the text as the competition between major powers over influence, security, and the shape of the global order. It's the traditional great power rivalry we've seen for centuries.
Sure. The usual suspects.
But the critical variable the text highlights here is a profound decline in trust and diplomatic cooperation. When trust evaporates, nations naturally increase their reliance on deterrence. They stop talking and start posturing.
Which basically means, I don't trust you to adhere to treaties or act rationally, so I am going to build up my military capabilities to a point where you are too terrified to step out of line.
Yes, and that posturing naturally feeds into the second mechanism, which is economic and resource stress.
Okay, a second dashboard.
The document points to intensifying competition over critical resources. And we aren't just talking about abstract economic indicators here. We're talking about the absolute physical baselines of modern industry and human survival.
Like what?
Energy, water, arable land, and critical minerals.
It's primal. Like, beneath all our satellites and artificial intelligence, we still need water to drink, grain to eat, oil to move machines, and rare earth metals to build the technology in the first place.
Exactly. And the geographic distribution of those resources is highly uneven. When access to those resources becomes threatened, perhaps by a regional conflict, or a sudden embargo, or even climate-driven disruptions, it creates immediate economic instability.
I see that.
Now, consider the perspective of a national leader. A government facing internal unrest because its citizens are experiencing rolling blackouts or massive spikes in food prices is a government under extreme domestic pressure.
Desperate times.
Historically, governments under that kind of pressure are far more likely to act unpredictably or aggressively on the world stage to secure what they need.
Or just to distract their population.
That too. And the text also specifically notes disruptions to global supply chains as a primary driver of this stress. Because of our tightly coupled global economy, a localized problem, say, a severe drought affecting a major shipping canal, or a localized conflict near a key strait can suddenly mean that critical components can't reach factories on the other side of the planet.
So the stress doesn't stay local?
No, it is exported globally through the supply chain.
Okay, so we have the classic drivers. Nations competing for resources, not trusting each other, posturing militarily, economies under strain. If we look at a history book, we've seen that movie before.
Many times.
It led to World War I, it led to World War II. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the third mechanism the text introduces changes the fundamental physics of the conflict.
Yes, technological acceleration.
Right. And I really need to pause and push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate for a moment, because the prevailing narrative in the tech world is that AI and advanced computing solve problems.
That is the pitch, yes.
Right. Shouldn't advanced technology give us infinitely better data? If we have AI models analyzing thousands of satellite feeds, scanning global communications, and processing logistical data, shouldn't that give our leaders perfect clarity?
You would think so.
Shouldn't that make us less likely to miscalculate and start a war by accident? We always hear about how machines can strip out human emotion and cognitive bias.
It is a very logical assumption, and it's exactly what the developers of these systems promise. But the objective Zezel document points out a terrifying counterintuitive reality.
Which is?
The problem isn't the quality of the data, and it isn't cognitive bias. The problem is the sheer speed of the systems processing it. The document cites reduced decision-making time due to the speed of technological systems as a critical engine of escalation.
Speed, so the velocity of the conflict.
Exactly. Let's look at the evolution of warfare for a second. In the 19th century, if an adversary mobilized an army, you had days, weeks, or even months to observe their movements, analyze their intent, send diplomats, and decide on a proportional response.
Plenty of time to talk it out.
Right. During the Cold War, the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles compressed that timeline dramatically. Leaders had perhaps 20 to 30 minutes from the moment a launch was detected to make the decision to retaliate.
30 minutes to decide the fate of humanity is already a total nightmare scenario.
But today, the architecture is radically different. We have hypersonic missiles that fly at Mach 5 or faster, capable of maneuvering unpredictably, leaving radar operators guessing their target until the last second.
Oh, wow.
We have advanced cyber capabilities that can strike critical infrastructure at the speed of light. And most concerningly, we have autonomous defensive systems that process targeting data in milliseconds.
Because humans are just too slow.
Exactly. Because the incoming threats are so fast, human reflexes are simply too slow to intercept them. You have to take the human out of the loop and hand control to an algorithm just to survive the opening volley.
So human leaders are increasingly being relegated from decision makers to mere spectators of their own defense systems.
Yes. The text argues that this drastically increases the potential for miscalculation or unintended algorithmic escalation.
How does that happen?
Well, let's say a sensor anomaly or a spoofed data packet looks like an incoming hypersonic strike. The human commander might only have 2 minutes or less to decide whether to retaliate.
2 minutes.
Yeah. The pressure to launch a counterstrike before your own command and control systems are destroyed is immense. It's a use it or lose it scenario. The technology doesn't give you clarity, it gives you a stopwatch counting down to 0, and the stopwatch is getting faster every year.
That is deeply chilling. Imagine sitting in a situation room. Instead of a team of seasoned analysts bringing you a thoughtful, nuanced briefing on an adversary's political intent, a red light is flashing and an algorithm is essentially screaming at you to authorize a strike in the next 90 seconds or you lose your entire retaliatory capability.
It's pure pressure.
It completely removes the possibility of a Stanislav Petrov moment.
Ah, that is a perfect historical reference.
For those who might not recall, Stanislav Petrov was a Soviet officer in 1983 whose early warning computers told him the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles.
Right.
The protocol was to report it immediately, which almost certainly would have triggered a full-scale nuclear retaliation. But Petrov looked at the data, realized that an American first strike would likely involve hundreds of missiles, not 5, and he made a human judgment call.
He determined it was a false alarm caused by a satellite glitch.
And he was right. He saved the world by disobeying the machine.
But if Petrov's system had been fully autonomous, or if the missiles had been hypersonic and he only had 30 seconds instead of 30 minutes, human intuition never gets a chance to intervene.
And that perfectly transitions into the fourth mechanism, the information and communication breakdown. Because it's not just that the stopwatch is counting down faster than ever, it's that in a modern conflict, you might not even be able to see the stopwatch clearly or trust that it's actually ticking.
Exactly. The document refers to this dynamic as the modern fog of war. The military strategist Karl von Clausewitz originally coined that term to describe the inherent uncertainty of the battlefield, a literal lack of information.
Right, you didn't know where the enemy was or how many troops they had over the next hill?
Today, the fog of war has been inverted. It is no longer created by a lack of information, but by an overwhelming flood of manipulated, weaponized information.
Like deep fakes and stuff.
Yes. The text highlights misinformation or incomplete intelligence influencing decisions as a primary catalyst.
Let's break down how that actually works in practice. Like, how does weaponized information paralyze a strategist?
Well, imagine that 90-second scenario we just discussed.
Okay, alarms are blaring.
The alarms are going off.
Hmm.
But simultaneously, your intelligence feeds are being flooded with deepfake audio of the enemy leader ordering an attack. Automated bots are generating thousands of fake radar signatures.
Oh, man, so it's sensory overload.
And crucially, the text pairs this with cyber attacks, disrupting communication systems. So not only are you receiving bad data, but your ability to pick up the red phone and call your adversary to say, hey, our systems are going crazy, is this a glitch or are we at war, is completely severed. The communication lines are jammed or compromised.
So you have reduced clarity at the exact nanosecond you need it most. You are blind, deaf, being fed hallucinations, and being rushed to make the most consequential decision in human history.
It is the ultimate degradation of situational awareness.
Wow.
And the final mechanism, the fifth engine of escalation, is what ensures that if a terrible decision is made in that fog, the consequences do not stay localized. The text calls it system interdependence.
This brings us right back to the sports car analogy and the just-in-time logistics we talked about.
It does.
The document points out our extreme reliance on interconnected infrastructure. It explicitly lists energy grids, global financial networks, and communication systems as being deeply, inextricably tied together. And the critical vulnerability it identifies is the limited redundancy in critical systems.
What's fascinating here is how the source text asks us to step back and look at these 5 mechanisms not as isolated problems, but as an interlocking engine of doom. They do not operate in a vacuum.
They feed each other.
Let's trace the causality. Resource stress, say, a sudden critical shortage of silicon wafers or lithium feeds massive geopolitical tension.
Okay, the first 2 mechanisms.
Right. That tension accelerates a desperate technological arms race to secure or synthesize those resources using advanced AI.
Mechanism 3.
That new technology relies heavily on highly vulnerable, globally interconnected digital systems. And if a conflict sparks over those resources, the first move isn't tanks crossing a border, it's cyber attacks targeting communications, which instantly creates the fog of war.
Mechanism 4.
The fog blinds the leaders, while the speed of the technology forces split-second, panic decisions. Those decisions cause shocks that cascade violently through the interdependent infrastructure because there is no redundancy to absorb the blow. Mechanism 5. It is a perfectly self-reinforcing loop of escalation.
It's like watching the genesis of a superstorm. You have the abnormally warm ocean water, the low atmospheric pressure, the specific wind shear.
Exactly.
Independently, they're just weather patterns. You can manage them. Together, they combine to form a Category 5 hurricane that wipes a city off the map.
A perfect storm.
So now that we understand the ingredients, the fuel of Objective 00, how does the theoretical fire actually spread? The document gives us a roadmap, right?
Yep.
It walks through the anatomy of a systemic collapse.
It does.
How do we get from a tense geopolitical standoff over a microchip factory to the total breakdown of a global civilization?
The text provides a rigorous step-by-step model outlining 6 distinct phases of escalation. And what I find most unsettling about this model is that the early phases do not look like an apocalypse. They don't involve mushroom clouds or alien invasions. They look exactly like the evening news.
Let's look at Phase 1 and Phase 2, though. I like to think of this as the slow burn. The text defines Phase 1 as tension accumulation. It describes geopolitical rivalries intensifying, accompanied by sustained economic strain and a measurable decline in trust between major state actors. If you're listening to this right now, that just sounds like Wednesday.
It really does.
It's our everyday reality. It's trade tariffs, diplomatic expulsions, heated rhetoric at the UN, and minor skirmishes in proxy wars.
It is the background radiation of international relations in the 21st century. But in the context of the Objective 00 model, Phase 1 is the gathering of dry kindling.
Getting ready for the spark.
Yeah, it establishes a baseline of fragility across the system. It means the shock absorbers are already compressed before the real hit comes.
Then we move to Phase 2, which the text labels disruption events. This is where localized conflicts, state-sponsored cyber incidents, or intense resource disputes begin to actively destabilize regional systems.
Right.
So this is where the theoretical scenario starts to produce actual visible sparks. Think of a border skirmish over a disputed river that provides hydroelectric power, or a ransomware attack that shuts down a regional hospital network for a week, or a politically motivated blockade of a minor shipping lane.
The operative word in Phase 2 is regional.
Okay, regional, not
Right.
global yet.
Right. The system as a whole is still functioning. To use your analogy, the sports car is still speeding down the track, but maybe one of the tires just ran over a piece of debris and is slowly losing pressure.
But the car is still driving.
Yes. The global institutions, the UN Security Council, international financial markets, established diplomatic channels are still fundamentally intact and capable of responding.
They can patch it up.
Exactly. They can deploy peacekeepers, inject liquidity into the markets, and contain the disruptions. The system is absorbing the shocks, even if it's uncomfortable.
But then we hit the critical pivot points. Phase 3 and Phase 4. This is where we cross the Rubicon. This is where the fire jumps the fire break.
Phase 3 is explicitly labeled escalation. The text states that conflicts expand in scale or complexity, potentially involving multiple actors and crucially multiple domains. The strategic concept here is jumping domains.
I want to make sure we are crystal clear on what jumping domains means, because that feels like the hinge on which this whole scenario turns.
Let's illustrate it. In traditional warfare, if two nations have a naval clash in a disputed sea, that's a Phase 2 disruption. It's localized to the physical domain of the ocean. The navies shoot at each other.
Right, boat against boat.
In Phase 3, one of those nations decides that instead of firing another anti-ship missile, they're going to launch a massive covert cyber attack on the adversary's central banking sector.
Oh, wow.
Or perhaps use lasers to blind their early warning satellites in orbit. The conflict has jumped from the physical domain of the ocean into the digital domain of finance and the spatial domain of orbit. It is vastly expanding in complexity.
And the moment it jumps to finance, suddenly neutral third parties get pulled into the blast radius. Like, if you freeze a nation's central bank, you are defaulting on thousands of international contracts. Global markets panic. Supply chains freeze because letters of credit can't be issued. So a dispute over a patch of ocean has suddenly inflicted massive economic damage on countries that have nothing to do with the fight. The fire is spreading wildly outside the original containment lines.
Which forces the entire global system immediately into Phase 4, which is system strain. The text describes this phase as critical infrastructure and global systems experiencing sustained, unrelenting pressure, which drastically reduces stability and response capacity.
Sustained pressure is the terrifying phrase there. It's not a one-off shock that you can recover from. It's a relentless pounding.
Right.
The global institutions are desperately trying to put out the digital fire in the banking sector while simultaneously trying to de-escalate the naval clash, and suddenly a major undersea data cable is mysteriously severed and a pipeline gets hacked. The capacity of our institutions to respond is being totally overwhelmed.
They're spread too thin.
The engineers and diplomats trying to fix the problems are running out of resources, out of time, and out of options. They are playing whack-a-mole, but the hammer is getting heavier and the moles are popping up faster.
And phase 4 is the absolute threshold. It is the twilight of normalcy. It is the last moment where the global system still has some semblance of structural integrity. Because what inevitably follows when the strain becomes too much is phase 5. And this is where the core thesis of Objective 1000 truly manifests.
Phase 5, cascading failures. Let's do a deep dive on this specific phase because this is the absolute nightmare scenario for any national security strategist. It's the thing that keeps them awake at 3 a.m.
It really is.
The text defines it very cleanly. Failures in one domain propagate to others, disrupting essential services and governance structures.
It's the domino effect, but on a civilizational scale.
To make this mechanism visceral, think about the breaker box in your house. If you plug a toaster, a microwave, and a coffee maker into the same kitchen outlet and turn them all on, the circuit shorts out. The kitchen goes dark. But you don't panic. You walk down to the basement, flip the switch on the breaker box, and the lights come back on. The failure was completely isolated and contained to the kitchen.
Right.
But in phase 5 of the Objective 1000 scenario, imagine the house is wired differently. In phase 5, the kitchen shorting out somehow trips a mechanism that turns off the city's water supply, which in turn causes the global financial sector to crash. The systems are so tightly intertwined, so totally interdependent, that a failure cannot be isolated.
That is an excellent way to visualize the lack of isolation. And we can actually trace exactly how that propagation happens using the text's parameters. We can map out a hypothetical cascading failure to show how realistic this is.
Walk me through it.
Let's say it's a Tuesday in November. A dormant, zero-day cyber weapon is activated, targeting a massive regional power grid.
Okay.
This isn't science fiction, by the way. We saw early versions of this when the Stuxnet virus targeted Iranian centrifuges or when hackers took down parts of the Ukrainian power grid. So the grid goes down across a massive geographic area.
Okay, the power is out. It's a blackout. People light candles, maybe they empty their freezers and have a neighborhood barbecue. It's an inconvenience.
It is an inconvenience for the first few hours. But remember, the communication networks, the cell towers, the internet exchange points, the fiber optic amplifiers, they rely entirely on that power grid.
Right.
Yes, they have backup batteries and diesel generators. But remember, the context, we are already in phase 4 system strain, meaning global supply chains are heavily disrupted. The diesel fuel required to keep those backup generators running cannot be reliably delivered because the gas stations have no electricity to pump the fuel and the dispatchers can't communicate with the truck drivers.
Oh, wow, so it's a gridlock.
So within perhaps 48 to 72 hours, the backup power fails and the communication networks go entirely dark.
So now we have no electricity and absolutely no communication. No internet, no cellular data, no phone calls.
And this is where it jumps domains again. Without communication and power, the local healthcare system collapses. Hospitals have backup generators, but they face the same fuel shortage. More importantly, without data networks, pharmacies cannot access patient records to dispense life-saving medication. Ambulances cannot be dispatched. Regional health monitoring systems fail.
That's terrifying.
Simultaneously, without communication and power, the regional financial institutions cannot process a single transaction. The ATMs are dead, credit card readers don't work, people cannot buy food or water.
Because you can't just hand over cash if the register can't open or the inventory system is down.
Right. The distribution of essential goods stops entirely because modern logistics rely on barcode scanners and real-time inventory tracking, which are completely dead.
And this is where the text brings in the ultimate casualty, right? The disruption of governance structures.
Yes.
Because if people are starving, if there is no emergency health care, if money is completely useless, and there is absolutely no communication from authorities, local governments lose their primary function. They lose the ability to maintain order. Panic sets in.
Precisely. We just traced the failure from a digital attack on a power grid, propagating into the physical realm of logistics and healthcare, cascading into the economic realm of finance, and ultimately collapsing the political realm of governance.
All the dominoes.
The dominoes have fallen across every single domain. And because our global system lacks redundancy, because it is that finely tuned sports car, that massive regional failure acts like a black hole, pulling the rest of the interconnected global supply chains and financial markets down with it.
Which brings us to the terminal state, phase 6.
The end of the line.
The document calls it simply breakdown. The definition is stark. It says, institutional control weakens significantly, leading to widespread instability or the collapse of coordinated global systems.
It is the grim realization of the objective Sao Zero's scenario. It means the institutions that we rely on to manage the world national governments, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, global shipping conglomerates, they no longer possess the capacity, the communication, or the resources to coordinate a response.
They're just gone,
Yeah.
or completely ineffective.
The sheer complexity of the system has overwhelmed the ability of humanity to manage or repair it.
We started this deep dive talking about the sheer convenience of buying a coffee, and we have traced the logical, structured, step-by-step path to the complete breakdown of coordinated global systems. It's heavy, it's an intensely dark map to look at,
It is.
but as strategists, and that's the hat we're wearing today, we can't look away from the map just because we don't like the destination. We have to ask the critical next question. If we actually hit phase 6, if the breakdown occurs and the institutions fail, what does the world look like the day after? What are the actual tangible implications outlined in the text?
The document is very methodical here. It divides the implications of Phase 6 into 3 specific categories: societal, economic, and technological. And I must warn you, none of them offer a comfortable picture.
Let's start with the societal impact. The text lists the disruption of essential services, which we just walked through in detail with the cascading failure example, the loss of healthcare, food distribution, and communication, but then it explicitly outlines a secondary consequence: large-scale displacement and humanitarian crises, leading to the breakdown of social order in affected regions.
This is a fundamental law of human behavior. When essential services fail, human beings are forced to move.
They can't just stay and starve.
Exactly. If a city of 5 million people suddenly has no potable water, no food deliveries, and no power, that population cannot stay there. They will migrate outward in search of resources. This creates unprecedented, massive refugee crises.
And a mass migration of that scale puts absolutely impossible strain on neighboring regions, which, remember, might themselves be teetering on the edge of phase 4 system strain.
It becomes a contagion of instability. The breakdown of social order is a direct consequence of a state losing its monopoly on providing security and basic needs. Society fragments into a pure survival environment.
And overlaying that societal paralysis is the economic impact. The text describes the collapse or severe disruption of global markets and the loss of economic coordination and trade systems. We aren't talking about a recession here. We aren't talking about a stock market crash where a 401k loses value.
No, not our.
We are talking about the mechanisms of the economy ceasing to function entirely.
Think about the physical architecture of global trade. Tens of thousands of massive cargo ships moving millions of shipping containers across the oceans. International banking clearinghouses moving trillions of dollars daily to finance those shipments.
It's massive.
That entire architecture requires 3 things: profound trust, perfectly stable digital communications, and secure open transit routes. In the aftermath of Phase 6, all 3 of those requirements are vaporized.
It's gone.
The text notes a long-term decline in production and infrastructure capacity. You simply cannot manufacture complex goods if you cannot source the raw materials from a globally distributed network.
And that leads directly to the third category, which honestly is the one that completely stopped me in my tracks when reading this: the technological impact.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is perhaps the most chilling and profound implication in the entire document. It's not just that the systems are temporarily damaged or offline. The text explicitly states there will be a reduced capacity to maintain or repair complex infrastructure.
Yes. This is the part that is so crucial for us to grasp. I want you to imagine trying to rebuild a modern microchip factory, a semiconductor fab, after a global collapse. If the global supply chain no longer exists, you can't just build a new factory from scratch with local materials.
Not a chance.
A modern semiconductor fab is arguably the most complex machine human beings have ever built. To make a modern chip, you need ultra-pure silicon. You need specialized lithography machines from a single company in the Netherlands.
Right, ASML.
Yeah, and those machines themselves contain over 100,000 parts, including ultra-precise mirrors from Germany and specialized lasers developed in San Diego. You need neon gas that primarily comes from Ukraine or Russia. You need chemicals sourced from dozens of different countries.
It's a miracle it works now.
If that highly fragile, incredibly specific trade network collapses, we don't just lose the smartphones and computers we have today. We lose the capacity to build the machines that build the microchips. We lose the foundation of the digital age.
Exactly. The theoretical knowledge might still exist in textbooks and libraries. We would still know how a microchip works.
Right.
But the vast interconnected industrial base required to execute that knowledge would be gone. The text refers to this as a potential regression in technological capability.
Regression, going backward. Objective 00 doesn't just mean a temporary blackout where we all eat canned beans by candlelight for a week until the government turns the power back on. It means a potential long-term, multi-generational slide backward in human technological capability. We would become a society surrounded by the silent ruins of a highly advanced civilization, dead cell towers, empty fiber optic lines, bricked servers but lacking the tools, the specialized resources, and the globally interconnected networks required to turn it all back on.
It is a profoundly dark scenario. It is the absolute boundary condition of extreme systemic failure. It's akin to the late Bronze Age collapse, where highly complex, interconnected Mediterranean civilizations just stopped functioning, and humanity lost the ability to read and write in certain regions for centuries.
It is incredibly dark, and I acknowledge that this is an intense, heavy mental space to occupy.
It is.
But remember the promise we made at the beginning of this deep dive. You told us very clearly this is a scenario analysis, not a prophecy. We have explored the absolute darkest edges of the map. We've seen the dragons. But now we need to look at the safeguards. Because, frankly, there is a reason we haven't hit phase 6 already. Our world has seen massive tension, cyber attacks, and resource stress, yet the grid is still on.
Very true.
So let's pivot to the mitigating factors. Let's unpack the safety nets built into this incredibly complex system.
Despite the inherent, undeniable fragility of the tightly coupled system we've described, there are massive structural constraints on escalation. The text is very clear that several powerful factors act to significantly reduce the likelihood of Objective 1000 ever occurring.
Okay, good news. The first one listed is the classic Cold War safeguard, deterrence mechanisms. The text notes that mutual risk discourages large-scale escalation.
This is the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. But in the 21st century, it has extended far beyond just nuclear weapons and now includes cyber and economic destruction.
Right.
National leaders are generally rational actors when it comes to self-preservation. When they look at the cascading failures we just described, they realize that launching a massive cyber attack that destroys the global financial system will simultaneously and unavoidably destroy their own nation's economy.
The blowback is too severe.
Exactly. The sheer scale of the potential devastation acts as a powerful psychological deterrent. You hesitate to burn down your neighbor's house if you know for an absolute fact that the fire will inevitably consume your own.
I understand the logic, but I have to ask, does cyber MAD actually work? During the Cold War, a nuclear launch was obvious. You could see the missile on radar and you knew exactly who fired it.
Right.
But with a cyber weapon, attribution is incredibly difficult. You might not know who turned off your power grid for weeks. If you don't know who to retaliate against, does the deterrence still hold?
That is the exact debate keeping strategists awake at night. The ambiguity of cyber warfare does weaken the deterrence model. However, that brings us perfectly to the second mitigating factor, the text outlines, which acts as a backstop even when deterrence is blurry.
Which is
economic interdependence.
Wait, I'm confused. Wasn't economic interdependence the very thing we spent the first half of this deep dive identifying as our greatest vulnerability? Like, the reason the failures cascade?
It is the ultimate beautiful paradox of the Objective Zerism text.
Okay, lay it on me.
The interdependence is both the fatal vulnerability and the impenetrable shield. Because our economies are so deeply, inextricably tied together, the text notes there are massive shared interests in stability. Destroying a rival physically or economically often means destroying your own wealth.
Oh, I see.
Let's look at the relationship between major global superpowers today. If Nation A relies almost entirely on Nation B to manufacture its electronics and pharmaceuticals, Nation A is highly disincentivized from launching a destabilizing attack on Nation B. The vulnerability itself creates a mandatory baseline of cooperation.
The vulnerability creates a mandatory baseline of cooperation. I absolutely love that framing. The very thing that threatens to destroy us is the exact mechanism that forces us to get along.
Precise.
It's like two people walking a tightrope together. If one pushes the other, they both fall. What else is holding the system together?
The text points to diplomatic institutions, which provide established frameworks for conflict resolution.
So talking it out.
Yeah. Even when tensions are incredibly high and public rhetoric is hostile, there are established back channels, military-to-military hotlines, and international forums designed specifically to de-escalate crises before they can jump domains.
And it mentions redundancy too, right?
It also mentions redundancy and resilience. While efficiency has drastically reduced redundancy in the private sector, national security strategists are acutely aware of the Phase 5 risk. Consequently, there are constant, quiet, government-funded efforts to harden critical infrastructure, create strategic national reserves of fuel, food, and medical supplies, and build backup air-gapped communication networks.
And the final mitigating factor listed is perhaps the most fundamental human one of all. Public and political incentives. The text states quite simply that there is a preference for stability over destruction.
At the end of the day, political leaders want to stay in power, and populations want to live their lives in relative peace. A leader who intentionally triggers a cascading collapse of the global system will very quickly find themselves without a functional country to lead.
Hard to rule over ashes.
Exactly. The fundamental human desire for a predictable, stable tomorrow acts as a massive gravity well, constantly pulling the international system back from the brink of Phase 6, even when we drift dangerously close.
So what does this all mean? We have this terrifying terminal scenario, Objective 00, and we have these powerful gravity wells of economic self-interest and diplomatic stability keeping us away from it. But the text doesn't just end with a shrug.
No, it gives us a path forward.
Right. In its final sections, it introduces these fascinating, almost philosophical concepts called alternative trajectories. It mentions two distinct paths for the future, Objective 10 and Objective 01. Can you decode these for the strategist listening?
The author of the document is framing Objective 00 as the absolute boundary of the worst-case scenario at the bottom of the cliff. But they are acknowledging that the real world isn't static. Human civilization is constantly moving along different evolutionary trajectories.
We're always building something new.
They contrast two potential paths for how we might organize our systems in the future.
Let's start with the first one, Objective 10.
The text describes Objective 10 as systems trending toward concentrated power.
Concentrated power. So a world where maybe a few massive superpowers dictate everything, or a handful of giant monopolistic technology companies control the entire digital infrastructure of the planet.
Exactly. A highly centralized top-down system. And the text makes a critical observation. This trajectory may increase tension under certain conditions.
What is that?
Think about the mechanics of it. If power is highly concentrated in a few nodes, the stakes of geopolitical or economic competition become an all-or-nothing game. The system might be highly efficient, autocracies and monopolies often are, but it becomes incredibly rigid.
It's brittle.
Right, it is highly prone to the technological trap we discussed earlier, where a very small, isolated group of leaders have a monopoly on advanced systems and are forced into split-second decision-making without external input.
So Objective 10 is a path that looks efficient on paper, but might actually steer us closer to the boundary of Objective 000. It increases the pressure in the system by removing the pressure valves. What is the alternative?
The alternative trajectory is Objective 01. The text defines this as systems trending toward distributed accountability.
Distributed accountability. I'll be honest, that sounds bureaucratic and messy.
It is inherently messier and slower than concentrated power, but the text argues it is structurally far safer. It states that distributed accountability may reduce conflict risk through transparency and cooperation.
How does that work in practice?
In a distributed system, power isn't held by a single central node like one massive server farm or one autocratic leader that can be easily attacked, compromised, or blinded by the fog of war. Decision-making is decentralized. It requires more diplomacy, more consensus building, and inherently creates more transparency.
Because if multiple independent groups, different nations, independent regulatory bodies, decentralized tech protocols have to agree on a course of action, it naturally slows down that dangerous technological acceleration stopwatch.
Exactly.
It forces a pause. It forces human conversation back into the loop.
A distributed system is less like the delicate, hyper-optimized sports car and more like a massive, interconnected forest.
I love that analogy.
If a lightning strike starts a fire in one tree, or even a grove, The forest as a whole survives and regenerates. The text suggests that intentionally moving our political, economic, and technological systems toward distributed accountability is the most effective structural way to mitigate the risks of a cascading systemic collapse.
That makes a lot of sense.
This raises an important question, though. It asks us, as strategists and as citizens, to actively evaluate the current trajectory of our world. Every day, new policies are written, new trade deals are signed, and new AI models are deployed.
Are we building the sports car or planting the forest?
Precisely. Are we building systems that concentrate power, remove human agency, and increase rigidity? Or are we intentionally building systems that distribute accountability, increase transparency, and foster resilience? The likelihood of Objective 1000 happening isn't just about avoiding a single war tomorrow. It's heavily influenced by the invisible architectural choices we are making today.
That is a profound lens through which to view the news. The next time you read about a massive corporate merger, or a new international security treaty, or a breakthrough in autonomous technology, ask yourself, is this pushing us toward concentrated power or distributed accountability? Are we making the sports car faster and more brittle, or are we planting a more resilient forest?
It's the most important question we can ask.
We are coming to the end of our deep dive today, and I want to quickly summarize the massive mission we set out on. We put on the hat of a national security strategist to examine the Objective Zero document, tracing the path from regional disruptions all the way to a civilizational technological regression.
And the document's final reflection sums up the utility of this entire exercise perfectly. Objective Zeros is best understood not as a prediction, but as a vital risk awareness model.
A risk awareness model. It teaches us that as our world gets more advanced, more convenient, and more deeply interconnected, we absolutely cannot ignore its underlying fragility.
We can't take it for granted.
No. The very supply chains and data networks that deliver your morning coffee with miraculous efficiency are the exact same pathways that can propagate a catastrophic failure across the globe in a matter of hours. Long-term stability isn't just about inventing faster technology. It requires actively managing diplomatic trust, preserving coordination across international lines, and intentionally sacrificing a little bit of efficiency to build resilience and redundancy back into our world.
And is a constant active process.
Yeah.
Systemic stability is not a default state of nature. It is something that must be actively, daily maintained by human effort. And before we conclude, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Something that isn't explicitly detailed in the phases of the text, but is deeply implied by the entire scenario we've discussed. We talked extensively about how our global stability relies heavily on things like economic interdependence and public incentives for stability. We actively avoid the breakdown. We utilize diplomacy because the leaders and the populations all vividly remember the horrors of past global conflicts. We remember how bad a systemic collapse would be.
We hold on to the historical memory of the risks.
Right. But what happens if a future generation, raised entirely within the seamless comforts of this highly efficient, perfectly interconnected world, simply forgets how fragile the system actually is?
Oh, wow.
What if they've never seen the breaker box flip? If they begin to view the incredible efficiency of the global supply chain as a permanent law of physics, rather than a fragile human achievement, will they still respect the deterrence mechanisms?
That's a scary thought.
Does our ultimate safety rely not on better algorithms or stronger military defense, but on our collective cultural memory of the risks? It's a sobering thought. If we lose the fear of Objective 00, we might lose the very thing preventing it.
A huge thank you to you for joining us on this incredibly intense, but I hope deeply illuminating journey today. We went to the absolute edge of the map, looked into the abyss of cascading systemic collapse, and studied the mechanics of the fall. But hopefully you are walking away not with a sense of fear, but with a sharp, new, strategic perspective. Look at the interconnected systems in your own life, the invisible webs of data, power, and logistics that support you with a fresh set of eyes. Appreciate the miraculous efficiency, but demand the resilience. Until next time.